All right, so sanctions. You hear that word all the time on the news, right? It's basically this big tool countries use to put the squeeze on each other without, actually starting a war. But how do they really work? And the big question, do they even work at all? Well, we're going to get into all of it. So let me start by asking you something. Think about this. Which country do you think has been under nonstop U.S. sanctions for the longest time since World War II? The answer might surprise you, and it's actually the perfect place for us to start digging in. Yep, it's Cuba. I know, right? That little island nation just 90 miles from Florida. The story of Cuba is pretty much the textbook example for understanding what this whole economic pressure game is all about. So what's the backstory here? Well, it all kicks off after Castro's revolution in '59. Tensions just kept ratcheting up until, boom, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're talking the world holding its breath on the edge of nuclear war. A year later, the U.S. made its move, not with missiles, but with money, a total economic blockade. And honestly, that one decision has shaped everything between the two countries ever since. Okay, so that gets us to the nitty-gritty. What exactly are the tools in this playbook? I mean, how do you turn money and trade into an actual weapon? At its core, the idea is pretty straightforward. It's about causing enough economic pain that a country has no choice but to change what it's doing. It's not just about punishing them for the sake of it. The real goal is to force their hand, to get them to end a war, scrap a policy, or maybe even topple a government. So with Cuba, the U.S. went with two classic moves from the playbook. First up, the trade blockade. It's basically saying, hey, we're not buying your stuff anymore, so good luck with your income. Oh, and we're not selling you our stuff either, so have fun with shortages. The second move, freezing assets. That means any money the Cuban government has in U.S. banks is locked up, completely paralyzing their ability to do business. But here's where it gets interesting. For decades, these sanctions, they kind of flopped. Why? Well, Cuba had a very big, very powerful friend, the Soviet Union. The USSR was basically bankrolling them, buying their sugar for way over market price, and just pumping in money. It pretty much made the US embargo, well, pointless. And then, everything changed. The Soviet Union collapsed. Cuba's lifeline was just gone, sliced off overnight. The effect was absolutely brutal. A 33% drop in their entire economy in just 3 years. That is what happens when sanctions can truly isolate a country, when there's no one left to help. Okay, but you can't exactly count on a superpower collapsing every time you want sanctions to work, right? So this is where a much bigger and way more controversial tool comes into play: secondary sanctions. Think of it as leveling up. It's not just, I won't do business with you. It's more like, if anyone does business with you, then I'm not doing business with them either. It's a power move that lets a huge economy like the US really flex its muscles and turn a simple embargo into a worldwide blockade. Which brings us to the million-dollar question, doesn't it? With all these different tactics and all the ways countries try to get around them, what's the bottom line? Do sanctions actually work? Does all this pressure really lead to the political changes they're supposed to? Let's look at a tale of two very different outcomes. First, you've got South Africa. The whole world pretty much got on board with sanctions, and it was a key factor in ending the awful apartheid regime. I mean, that's a clear win. But then there's Cuba. The Castro regime has hung on for over 60 years, no matter what the US has thrown at it. So what's the difference? It really seems to come down to two things: getting the whole world to join in and hitting a country where it's truly vulnerable. All right, let's jump to a more recent and frankly much messier example: Venezuela. This is a fascinating one because the sanctions absolutely contributed to a total economic meltdown, and yet they still didn't achieve that number one goal of changing the government. Get this, 300,000%. That was the hyperinflation rate in 2019. That's a number so big it almost doesn't mean anything. Your money, your life savings just becomes worthless paper. This is where you see the real devastating human cost of this stuff. It's not just a political chess game, it's a nightmare for millions of everyday people. So how did it get that bad? Well, it was like a surgical strike on Venezuela's one big lifeline: oil. The US specifically targeted the state-run oil company, which basically turned off the government's money tap. You can see it right here. The government's revenue just falls off a cliff after the sanctions really hit hard. But here's the thing, countries don't just roll over. They fight back, they get clever, they adapt, and they find ways to get around the rules. let's dive into the pretty wild world of sanction evasion. And when it comes to evasion, North Korea is in a league of its own. It's a really interesting puzzle, right? The whole point of sanctions is to cut a country off from the world. But what if that country has already cut itself off? Exports are a measly 1% of North Korea's economy, so traditional trade sanctions don't really hurt them much. Instead, they've built this whole other economy in the shadows. We're talking smuggling, state-sponsored hacking, you name it. Okay, so this leads to a fantastic trivia question. With all these heavy sanctions, no coal, no weapons, no seafood, what do you think is North Korea's #1 export? I'll give you a hint. You will never, ever guess it. Wigs. Seriously. Wigs, fake beards, false eyelashes. It's just wild. In this bizarre economic bubbles created by sanctions, North Korea has somehow turned itself into a world leader in hair products. And this isn't some tiny little side hustle. We're talking over 1,600 tons of this stuff exported in 2023 alone, with most of it going through China. It is just a perfect, surreal example of how a country under pressure will find literally any crack in the system to survive. All of this, it brings us to one last really important idea. It's this deep kind of backwards truth about what happens when sanctions drag on for years and years. You could call it the sanctions paradox. The big idea is something called sanction fatigue. See, sanctions have the most punch right at the beginning. That initial shock is a big deal. But over time, people in countries are resilient. They figure it out. They build new ways of doing things, they find new friends, they start a wig empire. The emergency feeling wears off, and suddenly, neither side feels much pressure to talk anymore. You just get stuck in a stalemate. And what's really crazy is that over the long haul, sanctions can backfire completely. The goal is to make people angry at their own government, right? But what often happens is that people get angry at the country causing the sanctions. It actually lets dictators tighten their control, point the finger, and say, see, all our problems are their fault. And the people end up trapped in this horrible, slow-motion cycle of oppression. So it all comes down to this really tough, sobering thought. The whole theory behind sanctions is that if you squeeze the general population hard enough, they'll force a political change from within. But what if that theory is just wrong? What if, in the end, the only real result is punishing and crushing ordinary people? That's the paradox, and that's what makes sanctions one of the most difficult and, frankly, dangerous tools in the world today.